Hello, and welcome to my channel. If you've been here before, welcome back. My name is Alfonso Peluso, and I'm a Studio Associate Professor in the College of Architecture at IIT, and I also teach at Columbia College in the Interior Architecture program. Shout out to all my students at IIT, at Columbia College, all the students out there who are watching, who are wrapping up their spring 2020 semester. I wish you all the best with that. Today we're going to look at using V-Ray for rhinos, and we're going to look specifically at materials. Did I say V-Ray for rhinos? I think I did. That's good. So V-Ray for Rhino materials. So some material basics using Rhino and V-Ray. We're going to look at a seamless texture. What is a seamless texture? So we'll take a look at that. Texture map size. What's our best practices for those material textures in terms of resolution. We'll look at using Rhino to size these textures, which is really important. So we'll use the box texture mapping technique. We'll make a wood floor, a brick wall to practice those texture mapping techniques, and we'll take a close look at glass. All right, before we jump into that, if you haven't subscribed to my YouTube channel, please subscribe. I'm looking to reach 6,000 subscribers soon. Also, connect with me on Instagram at my first name, Alfonso underscore my last name Peluso. See what I'm up to with my students, what videos I'm making. Alright, let's jump into this tutorial. So first thing we want to do is just start with looking at what the current scene looks like. And if you haven't seen my latest two videos, so I have V-Ray for Rhino Basics and V-Ray for Rhino Lights, that will get you up to speed with this. Alright, so let's take a look. Alright, so I'm going to open up the V-Ray window, and the first thing I want to look at is what resolution am I rendering out at. So I went to the little gear for settings, and right now I have it at 1200 pixels. Not very high resolution, but decent. But since I'm just going to make some test renderings, I want to lower that resolution. So I'm going to set this to 400 and take a look at what my current scene looks like. Now, there's two renderers. There's the production, which is the teapot by itself, and then there's the teapot with the hand, the interactive rendering window. So in this case, I don't need it to be interactive at the moment, so I'm going to use the production render. Okay, so this is where we are beginning. So we're going to start by looking at creating a material for this floor. And this is pretty low resolution, but one thing you can do is you can zoom into that. Now for test renderings, this is great. It renders quickly. You don't have to wait very long, and you can still see what's happening, and you can see what kind of adjustments you need to make. Alright, so let's go back over to a web browser, and if I do a Google search, if I search wood floor seamless texture, and I go to images. Okay, now the two things that I'm looking for. The first is I'm looking for something square. Now I can always make something that's a rectangle. I can always make it square in Photoshop. But if I can find something square to begin with, that's helpful. So the first thing is find something square. The second thing is find something that covers a lot of area. In this case, floor area. So for example, this doesn't cover a lot of floor area. So you're going to see this tile itself. When it tiles itself or when it repeats itself in Rhino, you're going to see a lot of that repetitiveness because it's only a small area of wood floor. This is maybe, you know, a foot and a half by a foot and a half. So we want something a little bit bigger. So I noticed that this one is a much larger area of wood floor. And it's not exactly square, but it's pretty close to it. So I'm going to go with this one. I am going to right click. and open this in a new tab. So open image in new tab to make sure that I'm saving the highest resolution version of that. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and right click and save this image. Now I like to have a materials folder to keep my materials in. Okay, and I always like to rename them. The internet will give them some strange names. So this is going to be called wood floor. Okay. So if I go back here now, I haven't checked the actual resolution of it, but just something to talk about. So this says it's 3000 pixels by 3000 pixels. That's, if it is that high a resolution, that's high. That's a high resolution. That's higher than the renderings that you are going to create. So you just need to keep in mind, if you're going to have a lot of textures in your scene, they're going to add up. And what I mean by add up is they're going to start to weigh on the computer, and they're going to slow down the computer. The computer has to load it into memory. So keep that in mind. If you have a bunch of 3000 by 3000 textures, you're going to want to resample those down. What should you resample them down to? I would say around 600 by 600 or 800 by 800. That is plenty high resolution. Okay, so we've downloaded this wood floor texture. Let's apply it to our scene. Okay, so now working in Rhino with V-Ray, so some tips with this. So if I make this viewport, if I make it shaded, I'm not going to see any of the materials. If I make it rendered, it's very bright. Now, what's important here is that all the lights in this scene are on a layer called lights. So when I turn off the light bulb, then I can start to see my scene. And as long as this is rendered, it's going to show my materials. Okay, so when I go back to shaded, you see there's no purple color on that box. But when I change it back to rendered, that material color starts to show up. The other objects don't have material color, so we're not seeing it. Okay, so we're ready to start applying materials. Now, if I'm working on just the floor, I like to isolate that floor. So the way I'm isolating it is I'm selecting the floor, I'm typing in invert. That inverts my selection, that selects everything else but the floor, and now I'm going to type in hide. Okay, so there's my floor. Now I can start to apply materials to it. Now, just going through my views here. So here's my camera view. If I double click on it, it goes back to my 4 views. Okay. I can work in perspective. I might want to work in a top view for some of this, but we'll experiment. We'll look around in the different views. Okay. So here I am in the perspective view. If I change this view also, if I change it to rendered, okay, I can see that floor there. It's got some reflective qualities to it, so that's why we're getting some sheen on it. Okay, so let's put this off to the side here. Let's make our material for the wood floor. So I'm going to click on the V-Ray window, and I'm going to click on the sphere, the checkered sphere as the materials, and I am going to right click and I'm going to choose generic. Okay, and I'm going to rename this. I'm going to call this wood floor. Now, I personally like to start with generic materials because a generic material has nothing in it. It has nothing that's going to slow down my rendering. It has nothing that's going to make Rhino or V-Ray crash. So it's starting from scratch, and then I add layers to it, and I'm in complete control of it, so I can troubleshoot when something goes wrong. Okay, so that's my wood floor. I'm going to apply that. I'm going to right click and apply it to layer. I'm going to apply it to my floor layer. Okay, so I'm seeing that is applied because it changed quickly. And what I like to do, and we'll do this a little later, is I like to just, again, double check, make sure that it's applied to that layer. So I'm changing this material color, and it's definitely changing in the scene. So I know it's being applied. I have no issues there. I know it's working. Okay. Alright, so now we're going to apply our texture. Okay, so to apply our texture, let's give myself some more room on the screen here. Okay, so still here under wood floor, this is the little pop out, and here is where I can apply my material texture. There's a little texture slot there. So I'm going to click on that, and I'm going to choose bitmap. So that's what you use for applying textures like the one we downloaded, textures or images. So I'm going to select bitmap, and just want to make sure I'm in the right folder. Okay, here's my wood floor. Okay, so now what we need to do is we need to figure out how to size this texture on that wood floor. You see right now, it's just really large. This wood floor, this floor that we're looking at, is 20 feet by 20 feet. So we have to tell Rhino and V-Ray what is the right size for this texture. Okay, so how do we do that? Okay, so let's go back and take a look at our sample. Okay, so what you need to do is, this is real world. You're making renderings, real world renderings, looking at real world materials. So you have to do your best at figuring out what is the size of this material. So when I'm talking about size at the moment, I'm not talking about resolution. I'm not talking about pixels. I'm just talking about area. In this case, it's floor area. So how much floor area am I looking at? Well, with wood flooring, that's pretty easy to figure out. Something like marble or granite, that's a little bit more challenging. But with wood flooring, we can size this material, figure out the floor material area based on the planks. These planks are a certain size that we can assign to them. So at the moment, this texture, it has 28 planks. So wood flooring comes in different sizes, 1.5 inches, 2 inches, 3 inches, and so on. So I'm going to say that, and that's up to you as the designer, I'm going to say in this case, each one of these planks is 4 inches. So there's 28 of them. That's 108 inches, about 9 feet of material. So I'm looking at about 9 square feet. Okay, now that we're starting to see where square makes sense to us. So I have 9 square feet. So that's what we're going to be setting over in Rhino. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to select that object, and we're going to click on the materials. Okay, let me scoot this over here. Okay, so sorry, not materials. We're going to click on properties, and under properties you're going to find texture mapping. Okay, and what we're going to then click on is we're going to click on apply box mapping. Okay, a box map will work for 99.9% of your objects. So we'll click on apply box mapping. Rhino's asking us to draw a box. So I'm going to turn I'm just making sure that my object snap and my grid snaps are off. I don't need to snap to anything. So I'm just going to draw a small box. Okay, so I'm just drawing that box. And this gets me all the time, is that there's an extra little step here in Rhino where you have to click yes for capped. Okay, so now what you see is this texture immediately changed size. Alright, now I'd like to see the box. If I need to see the box, I can click on show mapping. Okay, we'll come back to it. If I want to hide it, I can click on hide mapping. Okay, now to control that box, you need to make sure that this object is selected. Alright, so we said that this was about 9 feet or 108 inches. And it's square, so that's very nice. I'm gonna type in 108 for all of these. Okay, so now you're starting to see that texture change in size, and that's the appropriate size, 108 inches. So we have real world scale for this wood floor. Now once I've put all those in, I can lock it. or all three of those values. And if I want the texture smaller, I lower this value. If I want the texture larger, I raise this value. Okay, so the larger this value, the larger the texture is going to be. Now, let's go back to our camera view for a second. Okay, so here's looking at this wood floor texture in the camera view. Now, the reason I went from 108 inches to 120 because when you're working with texture maps and renderings, typically you want to exaggerate the scale, not huge, not to have these big wood planks, but a little bit larger in the renderings, just to accentuate the material, focus on the material. It's a rendering. Sometimes these things can be a little bit blurry, so I usually scale my textures up a bit. So that's what's happening there. All right, so that's our wood floor. All right, so let's practice this once again with. We'll go through these steps. We're going to do this with a brick wall. So if I go to my layers are on, but I did hide everything. So if I type in show, okay, I'm going to work with this wall here. Okay. All right, so let's go ahead and invert, and we'll type in hide. I'm going to keep my wood floor on also. Keep the two objects on that we've applied materials. So I'll select those two, invert, and I'll type in hide. Okay, now one thing we haven't looked at is how to rotate this wood flooring. It's going and it's going from left to right, and we haven't looked at positioning the wood flooring. All right, so we'll get to that as we work on this brick wall. Okay, so let's do the same thing that we did. We'll type in wood, or we're going to type in brick, seamless texture. Okay, so now something that I've talked with my students about a number of times is these textures aren't always seamless, and even when they are seamless, there's still some repetitiveness. So in future videos, I'm going to address that specifically, but today I just wanted to cover some material basics. Okay, so let's see. I'll find here's a neutral sample there. It doesn't have any watermarks on it. Oh, there's one little watermark in there, but I think we'll be all right. All right, so, and this, you don't always see those watermarks. See if there was one more maybe. Yeah, let's go with that one. Okay. So this one's a little bit lower resolution. This is 1024 by 1024. Okay. Let's go ahead and open that image in a new tab. Okay. And we'll go ahead and right click and save this. Call this brick wall. Okay. I'm going to take one more look. I know I was working with one earlier that did not have a watermark on it. Maybe it was further down. Oh. All right, let's go with that one. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and select this wall, and I'm going to make a material for it. Now, if I type in show, I have two objects on the wall layer. Okay, so we'll look at in V-Ray how I don't have to apply by layer, I can apply material by object. Okay, so let's, alright, so we'll open up V-Ray, and we are going to make a new material, generic. I'm going to call this brick wall. Okay, so if I right click on that, I can apply by layer, or I can apply to selection. So I'm going to select that wall this time and choose apply to selection. Now again, just to make sure that it's being applied and that's working before I get too far, start to change these, and you'll notice that these colors that I'm assigning, they get overwritten by the texture map. So at the moment we don't have to be concerned with the colors of these. Okay, so I'm going to click on that and choose bitmap, and I'll choose brick wall. Okay, so same thing. This brick is being stretched out on the wall. It's not the appropriate scale, so we have to assign a real world scale to this. Okay, so alright, so now the one that I found earlier, let's take a look at that. So I couldn't find it again on the web, of course, but I do have it. So I'm going to go ahead and open that file. So this is showing us how we can replace textures too. Like if this is the original texture and you have a new texture, you can always click on this little folder and get yourself another one. Let's go with this one. Okay, so this was the one without the watermark. Okay, now to see it on the V-Ray object, you just click this little, I click that little back arrow. So if I go back there to the map, I can click the back arrow. Okay, so now this one, if I go, let's look at it. This one, in regards to bricks, this has 24 rows in it because I want to figure out the scale of this brick. Okay, so you might have to take your notes on this. This is just my training as an architect, figuring out sizes of bricks. So I know that roughly every 3 bricks, so every 3 courses of brick, so every 3 rows, we'll call them, every 3 rows is equal to 8 inches. Okay, so there's, if I was to count all these bricks up, there would be 24. Okay, so there's 24 total, but rows of 3, we have 8 rows of 3. We have 8 rows of 3. 8 rows of 3. Okay, so every 3 is 8 inches. So 8 times 8 is 64. So that's what we're looking at here. We're looking at a square of 64 inches by 64 inches. So we're going to apply our box mapping to that. Okay, so with the wall selected, I can go to properties and I can add a box map. Now if you have, say you have a bunch of walls, like you have more than one, say you have 5, and they're all going to have the same brick material to them, the same brick texture applied to them, you would just select all 5 of them together and then apply the box map. Okay, you can definitely do that. Don't think you have to apply this box map to every single brick wall separately. If you have, you know, say you're working with a different material, say you're working with, I don't know, something that has some wall covering on it, same scale, you select all the objects with the wall covering and then you apply the box mapping. Okay, so I'm going to do that same thing where I apply the box mapping. Let's go over to a perspective view and take a look at this. So I'm going to click on apply perspective or apply box mapping. It wants me to just draw my little box. Okay, remember it's asking for capped yes. Alright, so now it's assigned a scale to it, and it's really small right now. It's 40 some inches. So I said that it was going to be 64. So I'm going to type in 64 for all of this. All three of these, 64. I'm going to lock it. And you see that that is the real world brick size. So we're dealing with almost perfectly sized textures, which is what we want. Now, I mentioned before that I like to exaggerate that a little bit. So if I go to my camera view, if I want the brick to be a little larger, that doesn't look too bad, but I can always, let's go for 72 in here. So that scales it up. So again, if I want it smaller, it's 20. If I want it bigger, it's 100. Higher values equals larger texture, smaller values equals smaller texture. All right, let's keep that at about 72 there. Okay, now let's go back to the perspective view. So let's say I'm, need to be very strategic in terms of placing these. Now, this brick size is working really well on this wall. All right, so let's look at the wood flooring first. So I have the wood flooring selected, and over under my properties panel, I'm going to click on show mapping. Okay, so there's my little, I'll call it a gizmo. I come from the world of originally rendering in 3ds Max, and we used to call these things gizmos. So now I can move this. I can be very specific. You see, as I'm moving that gizmo around, it's moving the texture. So if I need to line it up with something, that's going to work really well for me. Okay, so you see that moving around. And the reason I'm choosing box is that it then will wrap on the sides of this. So you have also some control in this direction. You see the wood flooring is moving on that face. Now there's ways to control how it looks on each of these faces also. So I mentioned that this wood floor is going from left to right, horizontal. What if I want to rotate that? So here's my rotation here, my XYZ rotation. It's just a matter of knowing, figuring out which one is rotating what. Okay, that rotated that side face, so that it wraps down on that side. So if I go back to 0, see that? And if I go to 90, now it's controlling how it's wrapping down on that side face. Okay, so if I go down to the next one and type in 90, okay, that's rotating the wood flooring. It was horizontally from left to right. Now it's vertically from front to back. Okay, so that's working with the texture map gizmo. All right. Last thing I want to cover, I want to look at glass. Now, glass is an important part of rendering. We all want to have nice glass in our scene. Okay, so I do have a layer for glass. I'm going to go ahead and turn off that mapping for this object. Click on hide mapping. Okay. Alright, so I do have a layer called glass here. Alright, so now let's take a look at this. Now, the way that I made these pieces of glass, they're just boxes. And I like to make these boxes with a thickness of 1 inch for the glass. That typically works well. Okay, so let's look at this through our camera view. Okay, we haven't done a rendering in a little while. I think that this is a good time, and I think it's important to look at the rendering without the glass first. Okay, so I'm hiding the glass, and I'm going to go ahead and make sure I save. You guys should save very often. Okay, now if I turn my lights on, it's going to be washed out. So it's a struggle. I know that the Rhino window doesn't match the V-Ray window. So to see what this actually looks like, I'm going to need those lights on. So to render it, that light layer has to be on. So to save some, to save my computer from crashing, basically, I'm going to change this to wireframe, and I'm going to turn those lights on, and I'm going to get myself a preview render. Okay, so, And I can do this direct. I don't always have to open up the V-Ray asset editor. I can control that here. There's the production renderer and the interactive renderer. Okay. We see what's happening here. Now the scene is a little dark, and for materials textures to show up well, they need a lot of light, or a decent amount of light on them. Okay, so what this is going to allow us to look at, we're going to start to look at the exposure value, because the glass is going to start to block out some of the sunlight that's coming in. So the scene's actually going to get a little bit darker. So if I turn on my layer for glass, now this glass is going to be fully, well, actually it has a material on there. Okay, because this came from another scene. So let's look at the difference between this. So that's with the glass off. This is with the glass on. Okay, so let's go through the steps of making that glass material. So let's leave this interactive renderer going. I have my fingers crossed that nothing is gonna crash on us while we keep that going. Okay, always, there's been times where I forget to stop it. So make sure that you either click here to stop the interactive render or click on the little stop sign. Okay, so let's look at this. Let's make a new glass material. So I'm going to right click, choose generic. I'm going to call this one glass 2. Okay, I'm going to apply it to my glass layer. Okay, so the room has changed dramatically because the sunlight can no longer come in. So we know it's applied. That's all the testing we need. Okay, so let's do this with our interactive renderer going. So here's glass 2. Okay, so first thing we're going to start with is glass is transparent, has some transparency to it. So we're going to click on the down arrow for opacity. And opacity by default is set to 1, or 100% opaque, or fully opaque. So we're going to start to dial this down, and it starts to become transparent, and we start to see through it. Okay, so that's the first thing. We want some transparency. Okay, the next thing we want is we want some reflectivity. So here we have reflection. So I'm going to go to the down arrow for reflection, and V-Ray has what's called reflection color. So I'm going to turn this up, or I'm going to slide this to the right, and we start to get some reflective qualities to it. Okay. Now, something else I want to look at is I want to look at refraction, because what I'm noticing is I'm not really seeing this glowing box reflect in the glass, or these light objects. I'm not seeing those show up yet. So I'm going to look under refraction. Okay, I mean, I can start to, I can keep going higher with this. Okay, and I start to see maybe a little bit of that. I'm starting to see a little bit of that magenta box, so that's definitely helping as I increase the reflection color. But I also want to look under refraction, and refraction has a setting called index of refraction. Okay, and that's happening here where it says 1.6. So, and I think the index of refraction on glass is around 1.55, but if I start to increase this, I start to quickly get control of the reflection, adding more or less to it. So that's a quick way to get some reflection. Now there's also color for these: reflection color, refraction color, which is going to actually tint. It's going to tint the glass. So you can experiment with that. I found that just adding a little bit of color to the refraction is helpful. So some desaturated blue-green color can be helpful with that. Okay, let's get that. It's pretty gray at the moment. Okay, again, I like to make that desaturated, so that can help you get a little bit of tint to your glass. Okay. One thing I want to figure out is what's going on with my sun. Okay, so let me go to my sun. Okay, my sun is on. Alright, let's turn off this layer of the glass. Okay, there. Just V-Ray, just kind of messing with me there. So turn that layer on and off, and that decided to come back. Alright, so let's go ahead and look at the exposure value one more time. Let's go back to the V-Ray window. Let's go to settings, and under camera I can raise or lower. So if I'm raising it, it's getting darker. If I lower it, it's getting brighter. Okay, so finding that balance is one of the more tricky parts of creating renderings. Alright, so I'm going to stop that there, and I'm going to render out a production. So production render, I'm going to go higher in resolution. I'm going to go to 1200. I'll go to 1280. Keep it 1280 by 720. And I'm going to render that out. Alright, so I hope that you found this video helpful. If you did, give me a thumbs up down below. I'm going to continue making some V-Ray videos. If there's something specific you'd like to know about V-Ray and Rhino together, go ahead and leave me a comment. If you haven't subscribed, please subscribe to my channel. Alright, I will see you at the next video.